Introduction. Some days don't announce themselves as important. They arrive quietly, overcast, routine, unremarkable beneath that stillness. Something stirs, urging us to step outside and pay attention. This book began with a walk, not for speed or destination, but for reflection. A walk through fog and wind, where each step sharpened awareness and cleared space for thought. What started as an attempt to escape stress became a way to observe the world and myself with honesty. Walking has a way of stripping life down to its essentials. In the quiet, we are left with our thoughts, our doubts, and the simple act of moving forward. What follows is a journey shaped by that movement, one of presence, reflection, and discovery found along the way. It is not a story of grand revelations, but of small moments that accumulate meaning over time. Each walk became a conversation between the outer landscape and an inner one, where questions surfaced as steadily as breath. In tracing these paths, I began to understand how movement can teach us to listen, to notice, and to change. Chapter 1. Waking Up. On the morning of September 2026, the first thing I noticed through my window was the overcast sky. I went into the kitchen and made myself a simple breakfast. Nothing fancy, just a ham, cheese, and bologna sandwich. As I ate, a thin mist began to roll in, softening the world outside. Near the last bite, I stepped onto my balcony and opened the door. The sounds of car tires hissing against wet asphalt, the dull thud of wheels striking potholes, and the distant chirping of birds slowly faded into a quiet void. Yet something about that grey, sombre morning stirred me. Despite the heaviness of the day, I felt compelled to go for a walk, not an ordinary one, but a long walk from my house all the way to the beach. Still, I wasn't quite ready. I had just woken up, no shower, no brushed teeth, no real sense of preparation at all. So I took care of that first. I showered, brushed my teeth, fixed my hair, and finally felt ready to leave. Then I realized I had forgotten something important. My journal, the place where I documented the world around me. I searched throughout my apartment, growing increasingly anxious when I couldn't find it. I worried I'd lose my train of thought once I started walking. Yet I kept searching until I came across the pen. Finding the pen felt like a sign that the journal couldn't be far. If I can't find it, I thought, I'll just write on my arm, though I might run out of space. Then I struck gold. The journal was resting on my bedside table. Relieved, I picked it up, grabbed my keys, locked the door behind me, and finally headed out. The moment I closed the door behind me, I sensed that something was still missing. My jacket? How could I forget that? But it wasn't just the jacket. I had overlooked a few other necessities for the walk ahead. The temperature hovered around a cool 42 degrees, and knowing I would be outside for quite some time, I needed to bundle up to keep warm. After gathering everything I needed, a quiet sense of peace settled over me. Only then did I step outside, lock the door, and finally begin my walk. As I descended the steps of my apartment building, a massive gust of wind hit my face. All the effort I had put into my hair was instantly undone, whipped into chaos. But I didn't care. I kept walking down the sidewalk, leaving the complex behind. The fog was so thick, I could barely see 10 feet ahead. If I reached out my arm, even that would vanish into the grey haze, swallowed by the mist. Yet, somehow, the obscured world only made me feel more alive, more aware of each step I took. That day, I had slipped on my simple running shoes, not for running, but for comfort during the long walk ahead. Yet the soles were thin, and with every step I could feel each pebble and every crack in the concrete beneath me. The wind howled around me, muffling most sounds, but I could faintly hear the low hum of cars on the road, distant and distorted, like a distant and distorted reminder of the world beyond the fog. I turned the corner of my apartment complex, heading toward the street where cars moved cautiously through the fog. Their headlights barely cut through the grey haze, and every moment I felt the faint pulse of danger. A car could lose traction and come too close. But I refused to let worry or anxiety control me on this walk. At times I second-guessed myself. I could barely see what lay ahead, yet I kept moving, step by step, through the mist. This walk was more than a stroll. It was a way to clear my mind of the stress and worries that had been weighing me down. It was a chance to reflect, to confront my thoughts, and to reconnect with nature in its rawest form. The wind whipping around me, the fog thickening, and the clouds threatening rain. The American tradition is one of walking as a form of discovery, while the British tradition is one of walking as a means of recovery. I carried both traditions with me as I walked, unsure which one I needed more. Discovery implied uncovering something new, something hidden just beyond the fog. Recovery suggested that whatever I was looking for had already been with me once and had somehow been misplaced. With each step, the line between the two blurred. I wasn't certain whether I was moving toward an answer or back toward myself. The farther I went, the quieter everything became. Houses thinned out, their shapes dissolving into vague silhouettes. Street signs emerged suddenly and vanished just as fast, like fleeting thoughts I couldn't quite hold on to. My breath fogged the air in front of me, visible proof that I was still here, still moving. I opened my journal while walking, steadying it against my chest, and scribbled a few uneven lines of observations, fragments, and half-formed ideas. The cold stiffened my fingers, but I welcomed the discomfort. It anchored me in my body, kept me present. At some point, the apartment complex disappeared entirely behind me. The familiar shapes of balconies, windows, and doorways dissolved into the grey haze, leaving nothing but a blurred emptiness where home had been. For a brief moment, I paused, the sudden absence of reference points making me feel unmoored. The sidewalks stretched ahead like pale ribbons, slick and shining under the faint, diffused light. Every step I took seemed louder than it should, my shoes crunching on scattered leaves and gravel, each sound echoing strangely in the thick silence. I opened my journal again, writing as I walked. I tried to capture the atmosphere, the oppressive weight of the fog that seemed to press against my chest and curl around my shoulders. I wrote about the way it softened every edge, turning street signs into ghosts and parked cars into shadowy forms, their outlines uncertain. The trees lining the streets were skeletal, their bare branches bending under the damp, invisible weight of mist, and even the puddles reflected nothing but a pale, indistinct grey. Everything felt suspended, caught in a liminal state between clarity and obscurity. The silence was nearly complete, broken only by the occasional drip of water from rooftops or the faint scuff of some distant movement I couldn't place. I wrote that down, too, trying to pin the sounds onto the page, knowing that in the fog, perception and reality seemed to blur. Even the air felt different, thick, cool, and heavy with moisture, smelling faintly of wet earth and decay, the kind of smell that makes the mind wander to quiet, lonely thoughts. I noticed how the fog seemed to amplify my own presence. My breathing, once mundane, became a rhythm I couldn't ignore, visible puffs marking each inhale and exhale. My fingers, stiff from the cold, moved more slowly across the page, and yet the act of writing kept me grounded. I scribbled about the way the fog blurred the world into a series of impressions rather than details. The hint of a fence here, the shadow of a streetlight there, the suggestion of movement behind a curtained window. It was all fragmented, fleeting, and slightly haunting. And yet, despite, or maybe because of the heaviness, I felt a strange clarity. The fog didn't hide the world. It forced me to notice what I could, to observe the little things that might otherwise be overlooked. Every puddle, every leaf, every faint reflection became meaningful. In documenting it, I felt connected to the street, to the day, to the quiet rhythm of being alive in a world that seemed almost suspended in grey. Step by step, word by word, I kept moving, caught between the weight of the air and the strange exhilaration of discovery. Chapter 2. Between Clarity and Mist. The mist had a way of reshaping everything, turning familiar streets into uncharted territory. Mailboxes looked like sculptures, sidewalks like rivers of grey glass, and even the smallest garden shrub became a mysterious silhouette. I passed a row of hedges, noticing tiny droplets clinging to each leaf, refracting the dim light into faint sparkles. Something about that fragile beauty, the way the world could create art without intention, made me pause. I leaned over the wet metal railing of a fire escape, letting my fingertips trace its cold edges, and imagined that even the most mundane objects carried stories I had never bothered to notice. A sudden movement caught my eye. A cat slinking along a driveway, its fur damp, each step deliberate. It froze when it saw me, bright green eyes gleaming through the grey, before disappearing again into a shadowed alley. I smiled at the small, silent drama, feeling a kinship with its cautious curiosity. The world was alive in ways I had forgotten to observe, and I was rediscovering it, step by step, through the fog's quiet lens. The streets began to slope downward, leading me toward a part of town I rarely visited. Old brick buildings lined the way, some abandoned, their windows cracked and frames warped by years of neglect. Yet even decay had its own quiet poetry. Ivy climbed stubbornly along a crumbling wall, tiny wildflowers grew through the cracks of the sidewalk, and the mist softened the harsh edges so that even ruin felt gentle. I made a note in my journal. Resilience hides in subtle forms. I passed a small bakery, its sign swinging lightly in the wind. Through the fogged windows I could see shapes moving behind glass. A baker kneading dough, a tray of pastries glistening with moisture. A narrow alley beckoned, half hidden between two buildings, almost swallowed by the mist. Curiosity overcame caution. I stepped in, careful not to slip on the wet cobblestones. The alley was quiet, but not empty. Faint graffiti told stories in colours muted by the fog. A single window had a lantern burning behind lace curtains, casting golden patterns on the damp bricks. I felt the alley's intimacy, the sense that hidden places contained truths unavailable on main streets. Every corner seemed alive with potential narratives, waiting for a walker willing to slow down and witness. As I emerged from the alley, the sound of water grew louder. A narrow canal ran alongside the street, its surface glassy under the grey sky. Ducks floated lazily, rippling the reflection with every movement. I lingered, letting the rhythm of the water match the pulse in my chest. A discarded paper cup drifted by, bobbing as if caught in some small adventure. I bent to write in my journal. Even debris has a story. Observation is a form of respect. The wind picked up again, carrying subtle scents of damp earth, wet leaves, and old brick. I drew the collar of my jacket tighter, enjoying the way the cool air brushed against my skin. My hands, still numb from walking, wrote with deliberate slowness, each word a small anchor in the grey uncertainty. Soon, a playground appeared, half hidden in fog. Swings swayed silently, as though the wind had borrowed the energy of absent children. I paused, imagining laughter and shouts echoing in this quiet morning. The silence made me hyper-aware of my own presence, the squeak of my shoes on wet asphalt, the faint scratching of pen against paper, the subtle pressure of the fog on my shoulders. I realized I had never really listened to the world this way, an attentive, patient listening. Across the street, a dog barked once, distant and muffled. I smiled at the interruption, a reminder that life continued beyond my small bubble of observation. Even the faintest sounds felt amplified, full of meaning. I wrote in my journal, "Attention transforms the mundane into the extraordinary." The mist thickened as I followed a narrow lane that curved unexpectedly between buildings. Streetlights became dim lanterns, their glow barely penetrating the grey veil. I noticed patterns in the mist itself, the way it moved, curling around corners, pooling in low spots, gathering on rooftops. The fog created illusions, shadows that shifted just beyond perception, fleeting shapes that seemed animate before vanishing entirely. Each step became a negotiation between caution and curiosity. I came across a small park I hadn't noticed before. Its pathways were lined with skeletal trees, their branches bending under the invisible weight of moisture. A puddle stretched across the walkway, reflecting the fog in uneven shards. I stepped carefully, feeling each stone and crack beneath my shoes. In a brief, meditative moment, I realized I was tracing a map of my own awareness, one step at a time. I scribbled, "Observation is a quiet journey inward." As I moved through the park, I noticed a narrow bridge crossing a shallow creek. The water flowed slowly, carrying fallen leaves in muted swirls. I leaned over the railing, pressing my fingers against the cold metal, and watched the current. It was steady, unhurried, entirely indifferent to my presence, and yet, somehow, comforting. My reflection in the water was distorted, wavering with every ripple. I smiled, acknowledging that even when I couldn't fully understand myself, I could at least observe. The streets opened up again, lined with buildings of different eras, some modern, some crumbling, all softened by the haze. I passed a row of shuttered shops, noticing the faint remnants of painted signs and peeling posters. Someone had scribbled a short poem on a wall. "Everything passes, even fog." I lingered, struck by the simple wisdom. Even the smallest traces of human presence became amplified in the silence. Time lost its usual rigidity. Minutes stretched and contracted, and I realized I had no clear sense of how far I had walked. Yet the uncertainty didn't bother me. Instead, it brought a sense of freedom. The day had become a continuum of sensation, perception, and reflection. I wrote one more fragment in my journal. To move without expectation is to notice everything. By now, my footsteps had become deliberate, almost ritualistic. I no longer tried to push forward quickly. I let the fog dictate my pace. Each street corner was a small discovery, each alley a secret invitation. I realized that my walk was no longer merely physical, it was a meditation in motion. The city, muffled and softened by mist, had become a living canvas, each element, brick, leaf, shadow, an expression I was privileged to witness. As I paused on a quiet corner, I noticed a single window illuminated behind half-drawn curtains. A faint silhouette moved within, indistinct but deliberate. I felt a strange connection, a reminder that lives continued quietly in parallel with my own. Without knowing why, I made a note. Even in isolation, we are always accompanied. The mist pressed closer, settling into the nooks and cracks of the streets, curling around lampposts and parked cars. I walked on, journal open, writing fragments of thought, reflections and fleeting impressions. Step by step, word by word, I felt the world expand, even as it became less defined. Between clarity and mist, every movement, every observation was alive, meaningful, and irreducibly present. Chapter 3. Through veil and light, by mid-afternoon, the sun had shifted high, but a distant murmur of clouds hinted at change. The air thickened with humidity, carrying the subtle scent of wet stone and warm asphalt. I noticed it first in the shadows. The light seemed dimmer, colors slightly muted, as if the city itself was holding its breath. The first low rumble came from beyond the hills, a deep, rolling sound that vibrated through the cobblestones beneath my shoes. I paused, lifting my face to the sky. Grey clouds had gathered rapidly, coiling and stacking like distant mountains. The wind picked up, brushing sharply against my cheeks, tugging at the edges of my jacket. Rain began in tentative drops, each one tapping a tiny rhythm on the pavement. Most people would have sought shelter. Most people would have slowed their pace, perhaps even stopped entirely. But something in me felt a quiet insistence to move forward through the storm, to witness it, to become part of it without losing myself. I adjusted my collar, tightened the straps of my bag, and stepped onward, letting the rain trace cold rivers down my arms. The clouds deepened, and the next rumble was closer, sharper. A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the streets in stark clarity for a moment, a surreal map of puddles, twisted branches, and glinting rooftops. I blinked, absorbing every detail, and noted how the sudden brightness revealed textures I hadn't noticed before. Moss-climbing stone walls, water gathering in cobblestone crevices, leaves trembling with each gust. Even in the storm, clarity persisted. The rain became heavier, hammering the pavement with insistent rhythm. I ducked briefly beneath an awning, but didn't stop long. The storm's presence sharpened my awareness. Every drop had weight, every gust of wind carried motion, and every flash of light reframed the city in a new perspective. My journal, tucked in my bag, would wait. Today, observation was bodily, immediate, alive. I followed a familiar alley, now transformed. Water streamed along the edges of the stones, joining in tiny channels that gurgled and twisted like miniature rivers. Shadows danced in the erratic light, flickering with every flash of lightning. I pressed forward, slipping occasionally on slick cobbles, but moving with deliberate care, attuned to both danger and beauty. The storm was not an obstacle. It was a lens revealing how fragile and persistent life could be. A clap of thunder shook the air, resonating in my chest. A flock of pigeons burst from a rooftop, wings slicing the grey light before disappearing into the distance. I watched them rise and scatter, feeling the strange exhilaration of witnessing chaos unfold while remaining anchored in my own rhythm. I crossed a bridge spanning a swollen canal. Water churned faster now, carrying branches and leaves in a hurried swirl. The reflection of the storm above trembled in the current, broken into sharp shards with each gust. Leaning on the railing, I let the spray touch my face, savoring the cold bite of reality. Even as the storm challenged the city, the patterns of movement of the water, the wind, and the flashes of light were unmistakably coherent. Clarity could exist even amid turmoil. Ahead, a narrow plaza offered scant refuge. Tables and umbrellas had been abandoned. Petals and debris clung to the wet stones. I walked through, each footstep creating a splash, each breath a cloud in the rain-slicked air. The storm made everything immediate. The city was raw, alive, and demanding attention. Yet I felt an unexpected calm. Perseverance here was a form of meditation. Walking through the storm was walking through clarity itself, defined not by comfort, but by presence. Lightning illuminated a tree beside the plaza, its branches heavy with rain. Tiny droplets shimmered like stars in the flash, before fading back into grey. I smiled at the fleeting beauty, feeling the thrill of seeing without delay, seeing in the moment. The thunder rolled again, but it no longer startled me. Instead, it became a pulse, a rhythm in which I found myself moving, step by deliberate step. Rain intensified, drumming against my jacket and the cobblestones, with an insistence that demanded attention. I reached for my journal, tucked safely in my bag, hoping to capture the clarity I felt. But when I opened it, the pages were sodden. Ink had bled into watery smudges, letters running into one another like faint, distant memories. The words I had written, the careful observations, the fragments of thought were still there, but distorted, ghostly, elusive. I pressed my hand against the wet paper, feeling the familiar texture dissolve under my fingers. For a moment I considered closing the notebook and letting it go. The frustration of lost words was real, yet there was a strange beauty in the ruin. The pages mirrored the storm itself, chaotic, relentless, yet illuminated in fleeting glimpses. Memory and perception are like this, I realized, never perfectly preserved, only suggested, hinted at in blurred impressions. I pressed on, the ruined journal a reminder that clarity exists not in permanence, but in the act of observing, of persevering through impermanence. Lightning arced across the sky again, slicing the grey and illuminating the plaza in sharp contrasts. I stepped forward, boots splashing through puddles, water soaking the hems of my pants. The wind tugged at my hair and jacket, and I laughed aloud at the exhilaration of it. The city transformed into a living, breathing stormscape, each corner offering new textures, new reflections. A fountain at the center of the plaza, usually gentle and measured, had become a torrent. Water cascaded over its edges, droplets scattering in wild arcs. I watched, mesmerized, as the currents played with the falling rain, and I imagined them as a kind of language, a pulse to match my own heartbeat. Every ripple, every flash, every rumble was a signal to keep moving, to keep witnessing. The ruined pages in my bag reminded me that even as moments pass and impressions fade, the act of moving through them is what matters. I tried to recall the words that had once been so clear. Fragments of insight, notes on observation, reflections on subtle beauty. Now they floated in memory like leaves in the storm-driven canal. Blurred, distorted, but not entirely lost. They were impressions, faint but enduring, much like the light that occasionally broke through the dark clouds above. I walked on, turning onto a street lined with older brick buildings. Water streamed along the gutters, carrying fallen leaves in miniature whirlpools. Each window reflected the storm differently. Some flickered with interior light, others mirrored the grey sky, and a few captured the flash of lightning, so sharply it seemed the building itself was briefly alive. I realized the city was a prism through which clarity emerged in fragments, never whole, never static, but always revealing something new if I kept my eyes open. The thunder followed me down the street, rolling and echoing between the buildings like a living drum line. I ducked briefly under a fire escape to shake off the heaviest rain, but even there the wind and water pressed insistently, encouraging movement. I traced my fingers over the soaked notebook, imagining it as a fragile map of my own perception, pages bent and ink run, yet still a guide to how I had walked through mist, rain, and light. Finally, as the storm began to wane, the clouds began to tear slightly, fragments of sunlight seeping through in brilliant shafts. The rain softened to a steady drizzle, creating a mosaic of reflections as the puddles. The notebook, now fully waterlogged, felt less like a failure, and more like a relic, a faint memory of what had been observed, a reminder that clarity is fleeting, but perseverance leaves its own imprint. I closed it, letting the wet pages rest against my chest, and continued walking, the city sparkling around me in this strange, renewed clarity. Even with the storm lingering, the streets glimmered with detail, leaves twirling in the wind, the shimmer of water on stone, fleeting flashes of light in the distance. The ruined notebook was proof that perfection was never the point. The journey itself, with its wet, chaotic, brilliant immediacy, was enough. Step by step, I moved through veil and light, through thunder and rain, learning to carry clarity, not as something preserved, but as something experienced. Chapter 4, Salt. At some point I realized I could no longer hear the cause. The hum that had followed me for most of the walk faded, replaced by a deeper, more constant sound, low, rhythmic, almost breathing. The ocean. I hadn't seen it yet, but I felt it before I reached it, a subtle shift in the air, heavier with salt and moisture. The ground beneath my feet changed too, the concrete giving way to packed sand, softer, uneven, forcing me to slow down. Each step sank slightly, leaving impressions that the wind and tide would soon erase. There was a satisfaction in this impermanence, a quiet lesson in humility. When the beach finally revealed itself, it did so reluctantly. The fog parted just enough to show the outline of the shoreline, the waves rolling in and retreating like they were undecided about their own existence. The water and the sky were nearly the same color, blending until the horizon disappeared entirely. Standing there, I felt small, not insignificant, but stripped down, reduced to something honest. There was no clear direction to look, no obvious path forward, only motion and sound, and the steady realization that clarity doesn't always come from seeing farther. Sometimes it comes from accepting that you can't. I stood there for a long moment, letting the wind push against me, letting the damp cold seep through my jacket, Whatever I had come searching for hadn't announced itself yet. But I understood then that this walk wasn't meant to hand me answers all at once. It was meant to teach me how to sit with uncertainty, how to keep moving even when the world ahead dissolved into fog. I sank onto a driftwood log, letting the damp chill seep through my shoes and socks. The fog pressed close around me, wrapping the beach in a grey so thick it felt like it was part of me. Everything was muted, the white caps of the waves barely visible, the gulls' cries distant and hollow. Even the wind seemed softened, carrying with it a kind of melancholy that weighed on my chest. The world felt suspended, caught between movement and stillness, and I couldn't tell whether I was walking into something new or simply wandering deeper into emptiness. I pulled my journal onto my lap, the leather cover cold under my fingers, and began to write. I wrote down the way the fog clung to the tips of the waves, making them look less like water and more like smudges of paint across a grey canvas. I wrote about the emptiness of the beach, the way footprints appeared briefly behind me, and were immediately swallowed by the sand and mist. I wrote about the low, constant roar of the ocean, a sound that felt at once familiar and foreign, comforting and hollow. Each word I wrote seemed to capture a fragment of the world, yet the more I recorded, the more I noticed how fleeting and fragile everything was. There was a weight to the air, almost tangible, pressing down on my shoulders. The fog, the muted sky, the grey expanse of sand, they all carried a quiet sadness, a reminder of how small and transient human concerns are in the face of the natural world. And yet, in that same heaviness, there was clarity. My pen scratched the page in loops and lines, capturing what I saw, what I felt, what I couldn't quite put into words. In documenting the bleakness, I was forced to slow down, to look harder, to see details I might otherwise have ignored. The way the sand glistened under the thin moisture, the slight curl of a wave before it collapsed, the way the fog rolled over itself in slow, deliberate folds. Even in its sadness, the morning demanded attention. I wrote that the beach felt like a painting left unfinished, but in that incompleteness, there was a strange beauty. Every note in my journal was a tiny act of discovery, a claim against the grey emptiness that threatened to swallow the world whole. The mist didn't just obscure it, but revealed, if only by forcing me to focus on what little I could see. Eventually, I rose and began walking along the shoreline. Each step carried a whisper of the water, a hint of the tide brushing the sand, soft and persistent. The driftwood logs became markers in a landscape that seemed eternal yet transient, each wave erasing and reshaping it in turn. The wind tangled in my hair, the salt kissed my lips, and for a brief moment I felt the rhythm of the ocean matching my own heartbeat. It was not a revelation I found, but communion, something simpler, slower, and more enduring. The horizon remained hidden, but it no longer mattered. I had learned that clarity is not always a distant point to reach. Sometimes it is the salt in the air, the weight of the fog, the trace of footprints behind you, and the willingness to walk forward anyway. As I walked further, the air shifted again. Beneath the salt and fog, a new scent emerged, the sharp green tang of washed-up chlorophyta, strands of seaweed strewn across the sand in tangled, glistening heaps. I bent occasionally to touch it, feeling the slippery texture beneath my fingers, the way it smelled both alive and decaying, carrying the memory of the tide's passage. It was a scent that seemed to root the fog and the waves in something tangible, something physical, reminding me that this vast, indifferent world was also intimate, immediate. From the nearby boats, another smell crept in, harsh and acrid, the stench of dead crab, abandoned in nets or lying forgotten on wooden decks. The odour was almost unbearable in its insistence, yet strangely grounding. It reminded me that life and death, beauty and decay, exist side by side, inseparable. The fog muted colours and shapes, but it could not obscure these truths, carried as they were on the wind. Each inhalation was a reminder of the world's textures, the brine, the algae, the decomposition, and of my own presence within it. I slowed my pace, letting the smells wash over me, mingling with the salt and the fog. The rhythm of my footsteps changed, matching the pulse of the tide, the gentle lapping against the hulls of the boats, the faint echo of water retreating over sand and pebbles. In the stench and the green rot, I found a strange clarity, a recognition that observation is never purely pleasant, never purely aesthetic. To truly witness, I had to accept the fullness of sensation, beauty, the decay, the odour, the cold, the salt, the wind, and let it all become part of the walk itself. As I drew closer to the line of moored boats, the stench of decay intensified, cutting through the briny tang of seaweed. There, caught in the shallow crevices of the docks and netted in the shadows beneath the hulls, lay the remnants of Carcinus Manus, the green shore crab, their shells bleached and cracking, limbs twisted unnaturally. Some had clearly succumbed in the nets, others had been discarded after the night's catch, left to the mercy of gulls and tide. Their bodies, once vibrant with the dark greens and russet browns of life, had surrendered to the grey-brown pallor of death, the exoskeletons slick with seawater and the subtle sheen of decay. Among them, occasional Cancer pagurus, the larger edible crab with its orange-tinted patterned shell, lay overturned, a grotesque miniature of its living elegance. I noted the way the claws, once strong and purposeful, now drooped limply in the salt water, the jagged edges softened by moisture. Even in death, the crabs bore the structure and geometry of their species, the delicate symmetry of their carapaces, the spiny ridges along the edges, the sharp curves of claw to joint. The sight was both fascinating and disquieting, a testament to resilience and to the inevitability of mortality. The smell was overpowering, a mixture of salt, ammonia, and something almost metallic, the product of decomposing protein, and the ceaseless motion of the tide. It clung to the nets, to the planks, to my jacket and hair, and in that clinginess there was a lesson. Nature did not shield its processes, it exposed them, laid them bare. The crabs had once moved with precision along the rocks and in the surf, scavenging, hunting, surviving. Now they were reminders that even the most meticulous patterns of life are fragile, subject to forces greater than themselves. But as I near the end of my walk, I realized what it all means. It truly means to stand between motion and stillness. I say this because from the storm-lashed streets of the city to the foggy, salt-laden beach, motion represents the world's relentless activity. The rolling thunder, the rushing rain, the tide, the shifting sand, even the decay of crabs on the boats. It is the flow of time and life, full of unpredictability, impermanence, and sensory intensity. Stillness is the awareness that arises when one stops or slows enough to observe. The fog hanging over the waves, the delicate patterns in sand and shells, the fleeting beauty in decay. To stand between them is to exist fully in the present, neither swept away by movement nor paralyzed by contemplation. Chapter 5. Lost on the way back. As I was traversing back home, I became lost in the fog. It did not happen abruptly. There was no sharp realization, no sudden panic. Instead, it arrived quietly, like the tide slipping further in than expected. I tried to anchor myself by recalling the scent of the rotten crabs I had smelled before, the sharp mixture of salt, ammonia, and decay that had clung to the docks. If I could find that smell again, I told myself, I could retrace my steps. Soon enough, I caught it, faint but familiar. Crab, brine, something metallic and sour beneath the salt. Relieved, I adjusted my direction and followed it. But the fog had thickened while I wasn't paying attention. The shoreline disappeared first. The steady breathing of the ocean grew distant, muffled, as though it had turned its back on me. The sand beneath my feet shifted from smooth and compact to uneven and dry, interrupted by tufts of beach grass I did not remember passing before. Still, the scent lingered, drifting in and out like a half-remembered thought. I followed it. The air changed gradually. The salt thinned, the wind weakened. What replaced it was a stillness so complete it felt padded, insulated. The sand gave way to firmer ground, threaded with roots. Pine needles appeared beneath my shoes, damp and fragrant. The fog did not lift here. It settled lower, weaving itself between trunks I could barely make out ahead. I stopped. This was not the shoreline. Behind me, there was no clear path back, only a pale wall of mist. The beach had dissolved entirely, erased by the same impermanence I had admired earlier. In front of me stood the suggestion of a forest, its edges blurred, its depth unknowable. I should have turned around. Instead, I stepped forward. The scent of crab was gone now, replaced by wet bark, moss, and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves. The forest held a different kind of decay than the shore, quieter, earthier, less abrasive. It did not assault the senses, it absorbed them. Each step sank softly into layers of fallen needles. The ground sloped almost imperceptibly upward. The fog clung to the branches overhead, turning spiderwebs into strands of suspended silver. The trees stood tall and indifferent, their trunks dark with moisture, their tops vanishing into white. The openness of the beach had allowed me to feel small in a vastness. Here, I felt contained, enclosed. The forest did not stretch outward. It rose around me. Vertical lines replaced horizontal ones. Instead of a horizon, there were barriers. Instead of the ocean's steady rhythm, there was a dense quiet, broken only by the occasional drip of condensed fog falling from leaf to leaf. I turned slowly, trying to orient myself. Every direction looked the same. The trunks repeated at irregular intervals, each one a variation of the last. There were no docks, no driftwood markers, no boats, only trees fading into blankness. A subtle unease settled in my chest. On the beach, getting lost had felt philosophical, almost gentle. Here, it felt tangible. The fog did not open. It closed. Sound did not travel. It stalled. Even my footsteps seemed swallowed before they fully existed. I walked deeper, not because I believed it was the correct direction, but because standing still felt more disorienting than moving. The air grew cooler beneath the canopy. Moisture gathered along my sleeves. The smell of earth intensified, rich, fungal, alive in its own slow decomposition. It struck me then how easily I had trusted my senses before. I had followed the scent as though it were a compass, but scent drifts, wind shifts, memory misleads, even sound can be absorbed. In the forest, there was no reliable reference point, no tide, no horizon, no distant boat engine, only my breathing and the soft compression of soil beneath my feet. Lostness here was different. It was not expansive, it was intimate. The fog pressed close to my face, damp against my eyelashes. The trees loomed without revealing their full shape. Depth became impossible to measure. Everything felt both near and infinitely far. I realized then that on the way back I had assumed return was inevitable, that turning around meant reversal. But the world does not preserve the exact conditions of our departure. It rearranges itself constantly. The beach had shifted, the wind had redirected, and I, without noticing, had followed what no longer belonged to where I thought I was. I paused and placed my hand against the rough bark of the nearest tree. It was solid, textured, real. For the first time since leaving the shore, I stopped trying to calculate direction. The forest was not something to conquer or decode. It simply was layered, damp, patient. To stand between motion and stillness here meant something different. On the beach, motion had been obvious. Waves, wind, shifting sand. Stillness had been awareness, but in the forest, motion was hidden. Roots grew silently beneath the soil. Moisture traveled through bark. Fungi threaded unseen networks underfoot. What appeared still was intensely alive. Perhaps being lost was not the absence of direction, but the removal of illusion, the stripping away of the belief that we ever fully knew where we were. I inhaled deeply. Earth, moss, wet wood, no crab, no salt. I had not meant to come here. Yet here I was. The fog moved slowly between the trunks, not guiding, not misleading, simply existing. And in that suspended quiet, I felt the same lesson returning in a different form. Clarity does not always arrive as a visible path. Sometimes it arrives as the acceptance that you are no longer on one. I did not know how far I had walked from the shore. I only knew that the way back would not be the way I came. And for a moment, just a moment, that uncertainty felt less like danger and more like truth. The trees thinned gradually, not enough to reveal distance, but enough to suggest interruption. The ground leveled beneath my feet, roots giving way to a patch of compacted earth scattered with splintered wood and pine cones crushed long ago. The fog shifted in tone here, less fluid, more stagnant, as though it had settled into something unmoving. Then I saw it. At first it was only geometry, a straight line where no straight lines should exist. A dark vertical edge interrupts the organic repetition of trunks. I stepped closer, and the outline assembled itself from the mist. A small log cabin, crouched low against the earth, its roof sagging slightly at the center, shingles darkened by years of moisture. It did not appear abandoned so much as forgotten. The logs were swollen and grey, their once rounded edges softened by rot. Moss threaded through the chinks between them, thick and velvety, as if the forest had begun to stitch the structure back into itself. The small porch leaned forward at a subtle angle, its boards warped and separating at the seams. One step dipped lower than the others, as though it had surrendered to weight long ago. The door stood closed, but not firmly, yet it rested in the frame without resistance, and the wood expanded from dampness. When I pressed my palm against it, it yielded with a slow, reluctant groan. The smell reached me before the darkness did. Old water, stagnant air, Mould, not the sharp rot of crabs or the metallic tang of salt decay. This was softer, but heavier, layered and domestic. Mildew clung to the air like breath exhaled years ago and never replaced. It was the scent of fabric that had absorbed too many seasons of rain, of wood that had held moisture so long it no longer remembered dryness. I stepped inside. The floorboards flexed under my weight, not dramatically, but enough to register instability. The interior was dim even in daylight. The fog pressed against the single window, reducing the outside world to a pale smear. Light filtered in weakly, illuminating suspended dust and spores that drifted lazily in the still air. The walls bore dark constellations of mould, irregular blooms spreading outward in charcoal and deep green patterns. Some patches were powdery and pale, others slick and almost velvety in texture. They climbed upward from the baseboards where dampness had settled, reaching halfway to the ceiling before thinning into faint discoloration. The ceiling itself sagged slightly between beams, water stains spreading in sepia halos, evidence of slow, patient intrusion. A thin line of moisture traced one beam and ended in a single drop that clung stubbornly before falling soundlessly to the floor. Against the far wall stood a bed. It was narrow, iron-framed, its once white paint flaking into curled fragments that exposed rust beneath. The mattress sagged deeply at its center, the fabric cover yellowed and mottled with spreading grey stains. A quilt lay crumpled at the foot, if it could still be called a quilt. The fabric was stiff with dampness. Its floral pattern faded into muted ghosts of color. When I touched the edge of it, it felt cold and faintly granular, as if the fibers had begun to disintegrate. The pillow was worse. It had collapsed inward, no longer holding shape, its case speckled with dark blooms of mildew that radiated outward like bruises. The smell intensified near it, a concentrated pocket of damp fabric and time. Beside the bed stood a small wooden table. Its surface was uneven, ringed with watermarks layered one atop another in overlapping circles. A ceramic mug rested there, fused to the wood by residue and neglect. Inside it, a thin sediment of something dark had hardened into a cracked disc at the bottom. A single chair faced the table, one leg shorter than the others, causing it to tilt slightly to the side. The woven seat had sagged, threads snapped and curled. In the opposite corner was a compact iron stove, freckled with rust. Its pipe extended upward through the ceiling at a crooked angle, sealed clumsily with hardened pitch that had split along the edges. Ash still rested inside the firebox, pale and undisturbed, as if the last fire had not been intentionally extinguished, but simply allowed to die. A small shelf lined the wall above it. 3 tin plates leaned against one another, their surfaces dulled and spotted. A glass jar without a lid held nothing but a thin layer of dust and the faint imprint of something that had once filled it. The air felt thicker the longer I stood there. Moisture gathered along my skin, not from exertion, but from the cabin's refusal to circulate breath. The silence was different from the forest's silence. Outside, quiet had felt alive, layered with hidden growth and subtle movement. Here, it felt suspended, preserved. Even sound behaved differently. When I shifted my weight, the creak of wood seemed to linger, as though reluctant to fade. I moved toward the window and wiped a clear streak through the condensation with my sleeve. The fog pressed back immediately, erasing the effort. From inside the cabin, The forest was reduced to suggestion vertical smudges in a field of white. It occurred to me that this place had once been shelter, a defense against wind and rain, a boundary between body and wilderness. Now it felt permeable, the outside having slowly entered through the roof and wall and air, claiming fabric, wood, and iron. The mildew did not feel aggressive. It felt patient. Decay here was not dramatic. It was incremental, a quiet collaboration between moisture and time. I stood in the center of the room, surrounded by evidence of habitation reduced to residue. A bed that no longer promised rest, a stove that no longer promised warmth, a table that no longer promised company. The cabin did not frighten me. It felt like a physical manifestation of what happens when motion ceases entirely, when stillness lingers too long without renewal. On the beach, motion and stillness had balanced one another. Here, stillness had prevailed, and yet, beneath the smell of mildew and softened wood, there was something else faint, but undeniable. The scent of earth. The forest was already reclaiming the structure, threading itself through cracks, breathing through seams. Even abandonment was not final. It was only another stage of transformation. I rested my hand on the rusted bed frame, feeling the cold transfer in my skin. Lost in the fog, I had wandered from shore to forest to this forgotten room. Each step farther from the ocean had brought me deeper into enclosure from horizon, to trunks, to walls. I had been searching for a way back. Instead, I had found what remains when nothing moves forward at all. And in that damp, quiet cabin, surrounded by the slow bloom of mildew and the sag of a forsaken bed, I understood something new about motion and stillness. When left unattended, it does not preserve. It absorbs. Chapter 6. What Remains. I should not have taken the walk. The thought did not arrive with urgency. It did not accuse me in the early years. It unfolded slowly, like mildew blooming across damp wood, first a faint discoloration, then a spreading certainty. Regret, when it is honest, does not shout. It settles. It becomes atmosphere. At first I told myself I was only waiting and waiting for the fog to clear, and waiting for the forest to open. Waiting for clarity to return in the way I once believed it would, as something visible, directional. The first night in the cabin was an accident of circumstance. The second was caution. By the third, the effort to leave felt less immediate. The forest outside seemed to rearrange itself daily, trunks repeating in endless variations, no two paths convincingly distinct from one another. I feared walking in circles more than remaining still. Stillness, at first, felt safer. The cabin demanded attention in small, persistent ways. The stove needed coaxing before it would hold flame. The warped door had to be wedged shut against drafts that carried wet cold through its seams. The mattress, sour with mildew, required turning to avoid its deepest hollows. I began to adapt. I learned which mushrooms could be eaten and which would hollow me from within. I learned to set crude snares along narrow animal paths where the forest floor dipped slightly. I collected rainwater in a dented tin basin beneath the eaves. I scrubbed mold from the table with handfuls of coarse sand, though it returned in thin grey veils within weeks. The cabin was not mine, but it grew used to me. Years passed without ceremony. Without a calendar, I marked time in subtler ways. The thickness of frost along the window's inner rim, the hum of insects swelling in warmer months, the brittle crackle of leaves underfoot during the driest stretches. My beard grew long, then white. My hands thickened at the knuckles, skin splitting each winter, despite my efforts to wrap them in scraps of fabric torn from the old quilt. In the 5th year, I stopped expecting rescue. In the 10th, I stopped imagining return. The ocean receded into abstraction. I could recall its image, grey merging with grey, but not its sound with precision. Sometimes at night, when the wind moved through the trees at a particular pitch, I would sit upright, convinced for a brief second that I heard waves breaking. But it was only branches shifting against one another. Memory erodes when not refreshed. The cabin decayed alongside me. The ceiling bowed further each season, water stains darkening and spreading in rings, like the growth of tree trunks inverted. The walls developed intricate cartographies of mould, deep emerald, charcoal, and a faint powder blue that appeared during the wettest years. The air never fully dried. Even in warmer months, a damp heaviness lingered, clinging to my lungs, settling into the fabric of my clothes. The bed deteriorated steadily. The iron frame rusted through in places, flaking into orange dust that gathered along the floor beneath it. The mattress sagged into a permanent valley shaped by my body. The ticking fabric split along one seam, exposing clumped stuffing inside, one soft, now dense and sour with absorbed moisture. The pillow collapsed into a shapeless pad, mottled with dark constellations of mildew. Still, I slept there every night. Loneliness does not feel sharp when it extends long enough. It becomes neutral, like background noise. I spoke aloud occasionally, if only to hear a voice break the stillness. I narrated simple tasks, splitting wood, cleaning a snare, boiling water, not out of madness, but to confirm existence. In the 15th year, insects colonized the floorboards in earnest. Moisture had softened the planks closest to the stove, and beneath them, rot advanced patiently. The first time I noticed the pale bodies writhing along a seam in the wood, I recoiled. But observation, once practiced deeply, does not vanish. I knelt and studied them as I once studied crabs along the dock. They were not malicious, they were precise. Life is moving through decay with a singular purpose. Food grew scarce in some winters. The forest did not always yield to effort. My traps sometimes returned empty for weeks. On those days, hunger pressed sharply enough to blur memory. I learned that disgust is a luxury sustained by abundance. When I began eating what the cabin produced as it decayed, it did not feel like surrender. It felt like participation in a cycle I had long contemplated from a distance. Decay sustains. The irony did not escape me. Years layered upon years. My body thinned, my back curved gradually forward, my stride shortened to a careful shuffle across softened boards that threatened collapse. The forest crept closer to the cabin each season, moss thickening along exterior logs, vines threading through gaps in the chinking. I turned 70 without knowing the exact day. I turned 75 with a persistent cough that settled deep in my chest, the damp air carving out a permanent rasp in my breathing. The fog still visited often, pressing against the window in familiar whiteness. Sometimes I would sit for hours watching it, remembering the first day it swallowed the shoreline. At 80, I no longer ventured far beyond the porch. The snares remained unset. My hands trembled too violently to tie wire with precision. I relied more heavily on what little the cabin offered: stored roots, the occasional trapped rodent too slow to escape, the small blind creatures that thrived in rot. The bed accepted me more completely each year. By 82, it had moulded entirely to my frame. The mattress sagged so deeply that climbing from it required deliberate effort. The quilt, reduced to threadbare fragments, lay across my legs like damp parchment. The smell of mildew had long since ceased to register as unpleasant. It was simply the air I breathed. I knew I was 82, not because I counted each year precisely, but because I remembered my age the day I took the walk. I had been young enough to believe in endless return. The math followed me quietly. In my final winter, the cold entered the cabin more boldly than before. The stove had rusted beyond usefulness. The pipe separated from its seam in the ceiling, allowing drafts to pour downward. Frost formed along the inside walls in delicate crystalline veins, outlining the shapes of mold beneath. My cough deepened. Breathing required intention. I lay in the bed longer each day, watching the ceiling sag in subtle increments. Water stains had merged into a single vast bloom overhead, dark and spreading like an inverted map. Occasionally, a drop would form and fall onto the floor beside me, marking time with patient irregularity. I did not fear death. I feared only that I had misunderstood stillness. On my final morning, though, morning and evening differed little through the fog. I woke with a clarity that had eluded me for decades. The forest was silent beyond the walls. No wind moved, no branches creaked. The air inside the cabin was thick, saturated with the accumulated breath of years. I turned slightly onto my side, the mattress sighing beneath me. 82. The number felt both enormous and small. I thought of the beach not vividly, but as a sensation, salt against lips, wind in hair, the low, endless breathing of the ocean. I tried to summon its sound once more. For a fleeting second, beneath the rasp in my lungs, I imagined I heard it, not outside, within, a faint rhythm, like distant surf folding and unfolding against unseen shore. My body felt light, despite its frailty. The mildew on the walls no longer seemed oppressive. The sagging beams no longer symbolized entrapment. The maggots beneath the floor continued their unseen labor. The forest pressed close, patient as ever. Decay was not the enemy. It was the continuation of motion I had once feared losing. As my breathing thinned, I understood something with quiet certainty. I had not been trapped in stillness. I had mistaken isolation for it. True stillness had existed only in those early moments on the beach, balanced against motion, alive with awareness. Here, in the cabin, motion had continued all along in rot, in growth, in aging cells, in the slow bowing of beams. I exhaled once, long and deliberate. The damp air filled my lungs and left them gently. At 82 years old, in a mold-stained bed, beneath a ceiling softened by time, I closed my eyes not with panic, but with recognition. The walk had never ended. It had only changed terrain. And as the cabin settled around me, wood creaking softly, moisture shifting, life beneath the floorboard stirring without pause, I returned at last to the balance I had once sought. Not between motion and stillness, but within it.